So a bit different than my Lestrals content, but today I want to bring you my deck profile for my Grave Zorga list. As Vanguard's my main game, I actually was wanting to make some Vanguard content, but then with the drop of Lestrals, kind of got really excited for that and focused my beginning content on that one. But now that that is, I shouldn't say the hype is dying down, but it's not as fresh as it was a few weeks back. I thought I'd take some time to kind of go over the game that I personally have been playing for almost 10 years now and find the most enjoyment out of. And really want to actually get this deck profile out here before DBT6 drops next month, and also before, well, it won't be before DBT7 drops in Japan, but also before I really start diving into wanting to try out decks from that set. So let's get right into it. So for my ride line here, of course I run the Grave Zorga because, as I said, this is a Grave Zorga deck. It's the new Zorga 2 run, so of course I want to run it. But I also just run the normal Zorga ride line. It is arguably the best ride line in Stoicheia right now, or at least best generic ride line. Roro is still pretty good. Decks definitely try to utilize that token engine. It's pretty strong here. But in terms of just raw card advantage, with so many phenomenal orders, just the ability to go +2 between these two cards is phenomenal. I mean, we've seen Magnolia run it for, I shouldn't say Magnolia run it, but you've seen some people running Magnolia for forever as like the go-to one in set 1. And still just does a lot of work in this deck, as this deck is still very much order focused, meaning that we can really take advantage of ranker change. Let's dig deeper into our deck, and Black Tears Husk Dragon, let's grab that back for some fun plays here. So moving on to my grade 3 lineup, I of course run the 3 copies of Persona Ride. They're just really good, giving your front row 10k in a 3 attack deck that is actually super crucial to be able to put up that pressure, as you really want to maximize your numbers and the pressure those 3 attacks give. Persona Ride allows that. And of course, just also gives us an extra soul for Zorga's skill, since we do need that soul. Soul's really the most limiting resource here, hence why you'll see now the orders actually have Soul Blast costs. So really good there. And then the other grade 3 I run are the 4 roaming Prison Dragons, because this card is essential to getting this deck running. Just being able to spawn 2 of them, really you ideally want 2 of them in drop zone, so you can easily just spawn them out whenever you play an order card to put up a lot of aggressive pressure. And then especially once you get into your Zorga turn where your Alchemy Magic, the extra crit just means that you're threatening lethal a lot sooner than a lot of other decks, and the fact that you can easily get 2 of these up as long as you have them in drop zone is quite insane, because then your weakest critical attack is your Vanguard, but even then you can check critical triggers. So really like this card. This was I underestimated a lot when it was first revealed back in set 4. Once I started testing it, I realized just how much just a free +2 on board each turn is for helping you conserve cards in hand, and just how that crit pressure is so necessary to really get this deck actually feeling threatening. So for them, obviously, because you want to see them ASAP, and you have so many discard costs such as Zorga, Ride Line, to be able to discard them. So the fact that it's a grade 3 with no shield value isn't too big of a deal. I only run 4 grade 2s, those being the Shadow Cloak, and that's just so I can run less orders, because these can search them out, and also just let me run more specific orders. Shadow Cloak is just a real easy way to be able to do that. And then it's also great on turn 2, as you can start setting up your drop zone for your Alchemy Magic turns, while also having attackers to attack with, and some interceptors as well. So I really like just seeing 1, even 2 of in my opening hand, just to be able to call them out, set up my drop zone for Alchemy Magic, and then just be able to rush my opponent. These are also, Shadow Cloak is also nice with its other ability, where when you play an order, you can Soul Blast 1 to gain 5k, but if it's Alchemy Magic, you also get to bounce a rear guard back to hand. And really, it's that bounce effect that I really play it for, not the 5,000 power. It is another Soul Blast cost for which conflicts with Zorga's skill, but that bounce just lets you get so much back to hand. It's so great utility-wise that I think it's worth running, and also just opens up a ton of plays that you can do with this deck, really allowing the drop zone to just be an extra hand. So if you can master when to use Shadow Cloak's ability and what to bounce back with Shadow Cloak, it is a phenomenal card, to say the least. The other nice interaction with this card is with Roaming Prison Dragon. If you call something off of an order card, you can actually time Shadow Cloak's ability first before Roaming Prison Dragon, so you can bounce it back to hand, and then you have more open rearguard circles for Roaming Prison Dragon, so you're not overcalling stuff. So that's another nice thing, the reason why this card works so well in the deck. And I think just overall synergizes very well with how I envision playing this deck. Moving on to the grade 1s here, I run 3 Actia Sticky. This card is very nice. I remember seeing this, I'm like, this is perfect, as it's another way to retire Roaming Prison Dragon, so you're not locked into the Tearful Malice, which is the other way to retire Roaming Prison Dragon. You're not locked into that for your Alchemy Magic. If you have an open Counterblast, you can just use Actia Sticky to reset them into the drop zone, which is crucial to be able to continuously use their effects turn after turn, which you really want to do. The draw and the 5,000, it really isn't worth the cost if you take it at face value, but it's very useful in a deck that you want to retire cards that recall themselves. So it ends up just being super synergistic and really strong, and you don't have to use it every single turn. That's another huge skill point of the deck, is knowing when to use Actia Sticky versus when to use Tearful Malice, and sometimes when not to use any of them, because if you have all four, if you have 2 Roaming Prison Dragon and Drop Zone 2 out on board, you can always just overcall. So still really great card, just allows a ton of great plays in this deck, and just to keep, honestly, really just there to help keep resetting the Roaming Prison Dragon, and also being a 13k booster is really good. Continuing on with the grade 1s, I run 2 Rogue Headhunter. This card allows me to actually guard early, or more regularly use my Counterblast on stuff like Actia Sticky, as it can help reduce the cost of my Alchemy Magic by Counterblast 1, meaning just extra Counterblast for whatever I need it for. So really nice, lets you also use Counterblast early, and then whenever I play an order card, it gains 5,000, so it's a 13k booster. Only at 2 of, really you can only use its effect in hand, as unlike Blue Zorga, this Zorga does not have a call effect, so therefore you need this card in hand. It's just the other reason why I don't run it at more than 2 copies, as while it seems a bit counterintuitive, as you want to run 4 copies to be able to draw into it, I think the 2 copies is fine, as it's just a nice bonus if you see it, and if you don't, you just have to play a bit differently. So I think 2 is actually a really, really good amount for it. You'd rather see some of your other cards instead of that. So I guess as a bonus play as opposed to a defining play of the deck. Rounding out the grade 1s, of course, I run 4 of the 6k PGs, as they are just better than the 7k PGs, allowing me to sometimes guard without having to discard is great. And then on top of that, since this is being filmed before the trial decks come out, I don't have, the order PG is not legal yet for English, but of course once that comes out, one of these is going away for that, as it's just an extra order in deck and it's super flexible. But until then, 4 of these, no reason not to. Also a phenomenal bounce target off of the Shadow Cloak. For my trigger lineup here, I run 8 crit here, for them being the Abyss Temptation, really can be just any generic crit, but of course I run 4 of the effect crit as well. So I guess first point is 8 crit because Zorga is the only column that does not inherently gain a crit in this deck, as long as you have 2 Shadow Cloaks to set up. Therefore, I want to maximize my ability to be threatening with Zorga, and the best way to do that was with critical triggers. Thus, ideally my opponent's at 4 damage, and they feel like I have to guard all of them, or risk being crit by a Zorga. And also, 8 crit just means I have extra reach in case my opponent heals down to 3 sometimes. Or maybe sometimes I can't set 2 Shadow Cloak on my first grade 3 turn. Still lets it be a bit more threatening, and I think critical triggers is just the best for a 3 attack deck like this. Next up, actually, before I move on to that trigger, I also forgot to talk about why running the effect trigger over the just vanilla trigger or critical triggers. Of course, the 5k makes better numbers, but a lot of the times with a Roaming Prison Dragon, if you're boosting Alana, the 4k doesn't really matter versus a 5k. It only matters if you're boosting Zorga, but frankly, I think its effect to be able to go to Soul is way more useful than anything else. The 2k power seldomly matters. The only time it would matter is in an attack pattern you don't normally do, so I'm not going to bring it up. But the real thing is just it gets itself to Soul, which can help you fuel your Soul to use Zorga's skill. You have to set it up a turn in advance, but honestly, if you guard with this, call it back with a Cloud of Miasma, and choose not to bounce with a Shadow Cloak, you can easily put it into Soul to be able to use next turn for Soul, which is really nice. So that's why I think this card is crucial, as sometimes it's a great way to just give yourself a little extra Soul, pamper yourself up for next turn, as it is definitely necessary in such a Soul-heavy deck as this, and I don't want to really waste space on, what is it called? Mania Carophilus? Whatever one is the on play if you have no Soul Charge too. It definitely is a thought in this deck, but I think you can easily manage the Soul if you know what you're doing and paying attention in this deck, so no reason to run a card that I think is suboptimal, especially since this card is way more flexible, being able to be bounced back to your hand. Moving on though, I run 3 front triggers to round out the more offensive trigger lineup, as the last 5 will be over trigger 4 heals. this deck does not need draws. You can tutor cards of Shadow Cloak to hand from calling from your drop zone. You also are plussing so much that you don't normally call from hand in the late game, so you can just conserve all your nice shield cards and some non-shield cards to block. So therefore, 3 front triggers makes the most sense. On top of that, since we're a 3 attack deck and we really want to maximize on numbers in those 3 attack, front trigger can just completely mess up your opponent's numbers, as it's 30k value, and these units can really take advantage of that extra 10k power. So front, I definitely think is the way to go in all Zorga decks. This one doesn't mill as much. That's the other concern with draws, is decking yourself out. I don't think that's as much a concern with this deck, but I just don't think draws are optimal from both an offensive and just trigger lineup perspective. For the heals, I run 2 of each of the effect heals. I'm trying to figure out which one is a bit better, and if I can actually afford to run the lower general shield count just to have the flexibility, especially with this deck being able to bounce so easily bounce cards back. I'm wondering if it might just be easier to kind of do it this way, just have the 2-2 split, as it lets you be super flexible against a lot of decks here. So it's just a matter of, do I find myself lacking shield value or not, and against which matchups I feel like I need which one. That's like the one thing I haven't tested, and one of the harder things I think to test as well, unless you're like hardcore testing for tournaments, which this has been more of a fun project than a tournament project for me. Finally, of course, run the Martinoa Bless Favor, the Stoicheia Overtrigger. I don't think it's wrong to necessarily run Olbaria in this deck, as the extra 10k shield or 100 million power can definitely be very nice in this build. But just the Omni trigger, it's never bad. It's really good. So I really like a Martinoa, plus I have the SP copy. I want to run it. So I guess to boil down the summary, I see some value in Olbaria, but this kind of does the work. And the one thing Olbaria doesn't do that I really like about a Bless Favor is that it's really a 9th crit in the deck for the Vanguard swing, meaning my Vanguard's even more threatening. And I think that's the real reason to run this over Olbaria, just for that kind of 9th crit, as that's super crucial, and it will help you win games a bit more of the time if your opponent no guards the Vanguard swing, or even chooses to hard guard it. If they choose to hard guard it, checking this will easily hit over a hard guard. So with the main deck out of the way, let me make some space for my orders. But time to move on to discussing the orders, which also helps with the main strategy of the deck as well. So triggers don't really play too much into this, so I'll move those out of the way. Moving on to the triggers, I run 2 Clouded Miasma as the main Alchemagic target. It's the one you're most likely bouncing back with Zorga's ability, unless you can afford to bind one. And this card is just great, as without being able to, since we can't use Grief, Despair, Rejection in this deck anymore, as it specifically needs Mysterious Rain Spiritualist Zorga, just being able to gain power with this order card, pretty much giving your Vanguard the ability to give your front row 5,000, just means that you're pretty much getting that 10k back also with Grave Zorga's ability, which is, if you did Alchemagic this turn, your front row gets 5,000 power. So really strong, really just makes those big numbers super crucial for this deck. And it's just a nice bonus that also lets you call something back as well, and just synergizes phenomenally with like Shadow Cloak being able to call like a PG, or maybe one of the triggers, like the front trigger to bounce back to hand, or one of the effect heals. Another fun play is also to use this to call back Grave Zorga and bounce it back to hand to get Persona right next turn, if you have the shield to know you can survive next turn. That's another fun play to make. But moving on to the next order, I run 2 Gather Upon Me, You Wandering Souls. This one's nice if I have surplus of orders in hand. I convert to extra drive checks, and there's no like distinct perfect combination with Clouded Miasma. So just having this card to get triple drive just means I'm more likely to check critical triggers, making my Vanguard just that more threatening for lethal swings. So I really like this. It won't come up all the time, as you won't always have a surplus of triggers in hand, especially with how much you're discarding between like Rideline and Zorga. But sometimes it is a great way to kind of clinch the game, or even just kind of filter out a lot of stuff from your hand, especially since we do run the 4 roaming Prison Dragons with 10 order cards. Your hand can get clogged up with no shield value cards sometimes, and this can help just cycle into new stuff. I also run 2 Tearful Malice. This one, it has been here ever since Roaming Prison Dragon has been introduced, as it is a great way to reset them, as since they're retired by the cost, by the time that you're considered to have played an order card, after the cost is paid, those Roaming Prison Dragons are in drop and see that and can use them. And then on top of that, well, it's funny, this is a set 1 card that was considered bad in set 1, and is actually now pretty good based on how it synergizes with everything else that this deck has gained. Just getting the extra counter charge helps with longevity for Clouded Miasma's ability, and one of the other order cards that I have that I've not shown yet. The extra draw is just always great, and the soul is huge in this deck with Grave Zorga. Great way to make sure you have the soul for next turn to be able to Alchemy Magic, or a great way to have the soul for Shadow Cloak to use, as you'll be able to Soul Blast out the order immediately. Do note, though, that a lot of times since I'm playing Clouded Miasma and then Alchemy Magicing it with Tearful Malice, it'll actually be the Clouded Miasma that goes to Soul, which even better to be able to Soul Blast it, as it just means now it's in drop zone it's free to grab back with Zorga's ability, and that can be through Soul Blast with Zorga or Shadow Cloak. Really nice. Next up for the orders, I run 2 In Search of a Faraway Ideal. This one is here because I want an order that doesn't cost anything, and that's just generically good. And this card does just that. There's not a lot of power gain outside of, there's one, Nectar of Sensationalism. I didn't really like that. I don't think it synergizes very well with Roaming Prison Dragon, and it gets better over time. So sure, if it's in the late game, there's 20 cards in my drop zone, Nectar of Sensationalism is going to be so much better, as with that card, you can only really give it to the boosters, since you really want to call it the Roaming Prison Dragons. So there is this line where you could say, oh, well, then just don't call one. Just call like a Shadow Cloak to the front row and give it Nectar and Sensationalism. But personally, I just like having the consistency of this card more so, as I can easily give it to a booster and give it plus 15k with this card. Because what it does is will give whatever you choose the ability that when your other unit attacks, this unit gets 5,000 power until end of turn. So what that means is that I can give it to either an Actius Sticky or Rogue Headhunter behind a Roaming Prison Dragon, and then what I do is I swing Vanguard first, gains 5k, swing at the opposite column, gains 5k, the Roaming Prison Dragon gets boosted by whichever one I gave it to, and because that whichever one I gave this effect to is boosting, not attacking, it does gain the 5,000 power from the Roaming Prison Dragon attacking. So that's a really neat way to just kind of pump out an extra 15k power, really put a lot of pressure on my opponent to either just use the PG or just force out way more guard from hand. So I really like it. It's also free, so just a phenomenal, super flexible order to kind of help out this deck. Finally, I run 2 Wild Intelligence. This is great on turn 2. If it's really on turn 2, if you have it, you'll either play Wild Intelligence or Gather Upon Me, You Wandering Souls. And Wild Intelligence is really nice. Sure, it costs a Counterblast, but lets you mill 3, which helps you find your Roaming Prison Dragons and get more orders to drop, which is why I really like it. And sometimes it can also put like Zorgas and drop to bounce back with Shadow Cloak, or really any of our other cards. But it just fits so well, and it's a nice turn to order play. It's a great like first Alchemy Magic turn when you don't need to reset Roaming Prison Dragons with Tearful Malice as well. And also just be able to plus a bit more on board in the early game where you really haven't established a board yet to conserve more cards in hand is also quite nice. As on the first turn, this is probably going to be the most likely one, followed up by, if really this was just generically good, this one if you have an order card, it's just I think a bit more generally good on that first turn, though you won't always use it, as if you have your Roaming Prison Dragons, there's no real reason to use this card, you can just use other cards. But still, just since we don't run Hendrina here, that's the other reason why to run the mill. So kind of that's my order lineup. I thought a 2-2-2 split of all of them was good enough. That way if any of them get damaged, I can easily get more to drop. Because of Zorga's ability to bounce back a specific order card, I can choose which one I want to keep in the drop zone. Most likely it's Clouded Miasma, but if I have like 2 in drop but only 1 Tearful Malice and 1's in damage, I can always go for the Tearful Malice instead. It just gives me better control over my orders overall, and that way I can be a bit more flexible. I just think that 2 of each is honestly perfectly enough with a Shadow Cloak and ways to mill it, and also you're actually going to go through your deck quite quickly, especially if you give stuff like Triple Drive and such, and with all the draw effects between Tearful Malice, Actius Sticky. Long story short, you'll be able to see what you need when you need it most of the time. It's not the most consistent, obviously, but I don't think running these at more copies, you could make the argument run Clouded Miasma or copies, but then once you start seeing multiples of them, you just don't really need it. So I think that this is the optimal setup. 5 orders that are super good, super fits into my game plan, and enough copies to see it to be flexible. Though I definitely do think there is room to be made in this orders lineup if you feel like you need to run specific orders to counter your meta. I just thought this was a good general order lineup, as it is more proactive versus reactive and easily change up. Like you could easily get rid of these In Search of Faraway Ideal if you need some removal. The only note I'll make about the orders is just be careful with Soul Blast cost orders. I know there's one coming out set 6 that I really don't like because it's a Soul Blast, and this deck is so particular with Soul Blast that, So that's the only thing you need to be careful of, is a lot of orders do Soul Blast. Alright, with all that being said, I want to also show off a few test hands to show like mulligans and general strategy in the early game and what you're kind of aiming for as you go into the late game. So let's see what we end up drawing into. So here we actually see a lot of orders here. We definitely don't need 2 Gather Upon Me Wandering Souls. 1 should be enough, and we don't want that heal trigger here. PG Keep is more just relevant on your matchup. In this case, I'm going to keep it, though in some matchups you'll definitely want to toss it back if you're like against a heavy multi-attack deck. Maybe you would rather just see raw shield value versus a PG. But as for these final 2 orders, I really like both of them, as I have discard targets, but also for Bride Line and also Rancor Chain's ability, but also because while Intelligence, they're both phenomenal orders to play going on your grade 2 turn. But I actually think Wild Intelligence is a bit better here without the roaming Prison Dragons. So there's an argument to be made whether you discard whether you keep only Wild Intelligence and Gather. But I think here we just keep the Wild Intelligence, as we're most likely going to want to play that over the Gather Upon Me Wandering Souls. And this way we can draw 3 to try to find more good cards such as Shadow Cloak for aggressiveness and also roaming Prison Dragon to help set up. So let's see what our next 3: Front, Crit, and Tearful Malice. So we didn't find any of them here, but that is fine, as we definitely now have some early shield value to help us guard and take advantage of lower attacks in the early game. As I said, that this deck can definitely afford to work off of 1 or even no counterblast in some situations. So guarding early is definitely not a bad thing. You just need to make sure you're able to do what you want to do during your turn. And on top of that, Tearful Malice isn't a bad one to have, so we can start resetting roaming Prison Dragons. It just means that if we can find a Shadow Cloak, we can focus on finding the Clouded Miasma over, say, a Tearful Malice to reset. So still some good potential in this hand. It's not an amazing hand, but definitely not a bad hand to begin with. So in this scenario, let's just do 2. We'll say we're going first in this one. So stand up Vanguard, we draw for turn, we see another crit trigger, and here I would say, since we don't really need to hold multiple orders in hand, let's just go ahead and discard the Tearful Malice. It's not too much information, especially since we won't be using it until later, as opposed to Wild Intelligence, which we'll want to use next turn. So we'll just write into the Rancor Chain, use Rancor Chain's ability, Soul Blast. You get to see 2 new cards, Crit, Shadow Cloak, that's good. And here, well, actually we have to show off the Wild Intelligence anyway, so that was me getting a bit ahead of myself because we're going to have to discard it anyway. But I still think that is fine. We'd rather keep raw shield value and discard the 2 orders since we can bounce them back to hand with no problem with our effects. So let's say it goes over to our opponent's turn. So here, when they attack, we do want the 1 damage for Wild Intelligence, so we will take it. So it is a Shadow Cloak, but unfortunate. Let's just say it goes back over to our turn. Usually on first turn, opponents don't aggress too much with a lot of the decks. So we draw for turn. Actia Sticky, pretty good here to start retiring the roaming Prison Dragons, but we haven't actually seen any yet. So here, Actia Sticky is actually a phenomenal call target. So let's actually discard it, since we'll be calling one off a Wild Intelligence, to ride Black Tear Husk Dragon, and add back that Wild Intelligence to hand. So here we have both Shadow Cloak and Wild Intelligence that we want to play. The question becomes, what order do we want to actually play them in? And I think Wild Intelligence is actually a bit better here. Since there's more order cards we want, we can possibly mill them off of Wild Intelligence and mill whatever we don't find with Shadow Cloak. So we can use Wild Intelligence here to mill 3. So we get Heal, Roaming Prison Dragon, that's good. And then another order, Gather Upon Me, pretty good. And now we get to call 1. So here, let's call the Actia Sticky as I suggested, and we'll just call it to the back row over here, because it is a phenomenal booster. We could actually call it to the front row if we want to be super aggressive, but really you just kind of want to force your opponent to take damage, and going wide doesn't usually lend to that. So discard that. Roaming Prison Dragon did not see the timing of me playing order, so it can't play it unfortunately, but that is fine. We'll play out the Shadow Cloak here. So that actually is a consideration here, because now Shadow Cloak will possibly get overcalled by a Roaming Prison Dragon if we can get a second one. But at the same time, this just makes a better column to push some damage here, and since we're going first, we want to leverage that. This will be more matchup dependent and situation dependent, but for this example, we can just set this up under the guise that we're just trying to get my opponent to 4 damage to start threatening lethal. So as I said, we did not find a Clouded Miasma, so we want to send that to drop. And our drop zone's looking pretty good. We pretty much have every single order except in search of a faraway ideal, which is probably our least important order to get to the drop zone. as we'll probably find it over the course of the game when we do need it. With having plenty of options in drop, we will definitely be able to do stuff. So here we have our board set up. Nothing else we really want to play in hand. So from here, we'll just swing with the Roaming Prison Dragon, or Black Tier Husk Dragon, and do our drive check. We always want to swing this first because of us having front triggers. And also here with only 2 units, it makes sense in case they guard this to pass it. But we get a heal here. Most likely, yeah, my opponent would be at 0 damage since we went first, so we get to heal the Shadow Cloak. And we can give the power here, or most likely they guard the 15k. Or that just hits, and we'd still have another swing. Depending on how they guarded will depend whether or not a defensive trigger would stop this or not. So, still pretty good. Get the heal in hand now. So it goes over to our opponent's turn. And here when they attack, we really need to think. Of course they could punish us by swinging the Shadow Cloak and passing, but we'll just assume that they do attack Vanguard here. We really need to think about what we want to do next turn. We don't need Actia Sticky because we do not have our Roaming Prison Dragon set up yet. And we definitely want to use Cloud Miasma as we always do, but we probably also want to use Wild Intelligence here because it can help us mill for more Roaming Prison Dragons, which we desperately do need. And here, Gather Upon Me doesn't do anything because we don't have the order in hand for cost, and Tearful Malice, same reason we're not using Actia Sticky. So we'll just say that we do in fact can take 2 damage. Sometimes we won't be able to, but that's just kind of part of the game plan sometimes. But a lot of decks nowadays are, so first check, Roaming Prison Dragon, second check, Zorga. So not the best damage. At least we can heal out the Roaming Prison Dragon, but it's not guaranteed. Persona Ride, but it is what it is. So let's say we stand, it's our turn, we stand and we draw for turn. Another Actia Sticky, that is actually a great discard target, just to keep shield in hand to go into our Grave Zorga. So here, let's just start. We can Soul Blast. We always Soul Blast the Rancor Chain because it can be called as a 10k booster to Vanguard later on, which is huge. So we Soul Blast that for Zorga's ability, and we have to discard 1. So here, if the opponent is not a crit focused deck, we definitely discard this. But if they are and we want to keep the powerful shield, we could discard an Alana or Abyss Temptation, with Alana probably being the better one, just in case you want to call that. Let's just say they're not a crit focused Vanguard, so we'll discard to be able to add back one of our orders. So here we will add back Clouded Miasma, as we want to use this pretty much every single turn. And now that we have this in hand, we don't really have anything else to do but play this, Alchemagicking it with our Wild Intelligence. So here it's Counterblast 2, so we'll play the 2 Counterblast. That ends up getting bound. And here we use Clouded Miasma's effect first to call 1, and our Vanguard gets the ability. So here, what do we want to call? Well, we have a Shadow Cloak to start bouncing stuff back, but at the same time, we don't really have too much we want to bounce back. We could bounce back if they're multi-attack the other heal. We could bounce back the other Shadow Cloak to start milling more orders. All those are definite valid options, but at the same time, do we need to bounce stuff back here, as we got good shield in our hand, and we can just start building up a better board presence. And I kind of like that idea where we can just set up better numbers by calling an Actia Sticky. Here, Vanguard gets the ability, and then Wild Intelligence effect lets us mill 3, so we mill an Alana, another Gather, and another Shadow Cloak. So no Roaming Prison Dragon, but that's fine. So now we get to call 1. So here, another thing to think about is we don't really need to bounce too much back with our Shadow Cloak here, so we could just make better numbers with Rancor Chain, or we could possibly call out an Alana to put the Soul, to just kind of get ahead on Soul and not have to worry about it later. We can also call a Shadow Cloak behind. We could actually bounce it back, recall it to mill another one, but I don't think we really need that either. It would also just be nice behind for more bounce. But here, I would say our best option here is let's just set up our Soul quite nicely with an Alana. It also will allow Zorga to hit over 25,000 since the opponent's Vanguard is still only, since we went first at, would be at 10k. So the orders resolve. Roaming Prison Dragon's effect resolves as well now. You get to call that. 10k plus 1 crit. We're not using Shadow Cloak's ability here, and we'll just go to battle phase. Swing a Zorga first always because of the front triggers. So let's see. First check, plan or prevent. Second check, over trigger. So that sometimes happens. We can just remove the over trigger from the game. I'll just set that. Where's it seen? Just set that over here. Get the so with its effect, 100 million wherever it needs to go. Extra crit wherever it needs to go can go to Vanguard if need be. Front effect is awesome. We do get 1 draw. And then, of course, heal. My opponent would have been at 2 damage at most, so we would get off the heal effect here. So here, we actually do get the other roaming Prison Dragon, and since we still haven't seen another one, we definitely want to get that there. We also get the remove and draw effect from there, so another Rogue Headhunter. So with 2, we drew into 2 more PGs, so that's phenomenal. We then put our Alana to Soul, and we can actually give the 2k to either one of these to just make better numbers against 10k. So that's already looking pretty good, and we can just kind of swing this one as the crit, looking really powerful. As you can see, we kind of set ourselves up very well for next turn, as we have a ton of guard in hand if need be. We can take more damage if need be, so unfortunately another Zorga. In search of faraway ideals, we can take stuff, we can even start guarding. But really, we're just set up well for next turn to be able to utilize Zorga's ability to bounce back Clouded Miasma. If we end up drawing an order, which we do in this case, we can then purposefully say discard maybe Rogue Headhunter, since we don't really need the Counterblast reduction, to be able to say bounce back that Clouded Miasma to hand. We can use Actia's Sticky on top of it to just retire. Well, we need to retire 2, so that's a good point. But we can just retire these 2, as we're going to overcall the Shadow Cloak anyway. We would get the draw 1, power plus 5,000, another roaming Prison Dragon. So you probably should have done that one first. That probably would have been better ordering there. I gotta have myself order, so we can drop that. Then we can, of course, Clouded Miasma, Alchemagic with the Gather Upon Me, You Wandering Souls. So now my Vanguard is triple. Well, actually, first we need to resolve this one first, so that'd be another Counterblast. We can call 1. So here, of course, we don't really have the bounce back with Shadow Cloak anymore. That is fine. So most likely here we would just want to set up our Rancor Chain to be a big booster for my Vanguard. Forgot to stand these. And then we can, against the power, of course, then of course we have the +1 drive from Gather Upon Me, Wandering Souls. And then, of course, I'm being very redundant here, we have the 2 roaming Prison Dragon triggers, each of them getting 10k and a crit. So at this point, even though we didn't Persona right here, I also forgot to Soul Blast for this. Even though we don't have Persona right here, we still have Zorga swinging in for 33k. We have these roaming Prison Dragon columns, where each of them are 25k on their own. This is a 13k booster. This one's an 8, or it really doesn't matter. One of these is a 13k booster, one of these is an 8k booster. Just hitting phenomenal numbers. And then, of course, with a triple drive, let's see if we hit anything. This case we don't. We have seen a lot of triggers, understandable, but it did up our chances by 1. But you can just see, you just kind of rinse and repeat from here, utilizing this big hand here. Probably would have used more to guard last turn, but just to kind of keep rinse repeating, bouncing back roaming Prison Dragons. Since we're out of Counterblast here, we could have just maybe taken 1 and say use Tearful Malice next turn. We could also try to close out the game with In Search of a Faraway Ideal, which I forgot to discard. But you can see we have all these options here to how to close out the game, and that's really where this deck thrives, and it's very situational, so you really just need to test it on your own to figure that out. All right, an example hand for going second here. So let's see, Wild Intelligence, Cloud Miasma, Zorga, Alana, Heal. So easy, 2 of back. But then for the rest of these, Persona Ride's kind of nice to have, but at the same time we're going second. So that is a definite point to consider. Cloud Miasma is also nice to have, and we also have the Wild Intelligence to mill more. So here would definitely be more matchup dependent, whether or not you feel comfortable keeping the Grave Zorga and possibly like the Clouded Miasma here. But for sake of just more showing off more, I think Zorga might be a good one to shuffle back here if it's more aggressive. Again, this is just more situational, it's hard to decide, so I'm actually just going to choose to keep it, as these are 2 crucial cards. Let's just say we're up against, say, a slower matchup. If it's a faster matchup, you would probably just want to keep Wild Intelligence. But if you're against a slower matchup, you might be able to afford to just keep the Zorga and the Cloud Miasma for a stronger beatdown. So let's see, we draw up front, crit. So he still end up with 2 triggers in hand, but that's fine. It definitely will allow us to be able to guard stuff early if needed, though. But really, we're just saving up shield for the late game as well if need be. So now you get this a good shuffle, and we can show off going second. Nice thing about going second is we actually do get a bit more card draw. We actually get to see an extra card. I mean, you have you pretty much with the Zorga ride line, you have the biggest hand out of everyone come if you're going second. So let's see, stand up Vanguard. So going second, draw for turn, see PG. So here, I would say we can easily start discarding orders as we want to play Wild Intelligence on our next turn. Discard that, Ride the Rancor Chain, draw 1 for going second. Heal, not great. Rancor Chain, Soul Blast, draw 2. Rogue Headhunter, that's interesting. Wild Intelligence, well, don't need 2 of those, so discard that. Pretty easy. So here, interesting hand, a lot of shield value. Definitely we'll be able to mill some more off of Wild Intelligence, not too bad. So, of course, we get to swing with Vanguard as well, so actually we start with 2 more cards in hand than the opponent. So let's see, what do we check here? Front Trigger, not too impactful, but that's fine. So we got a pretty big hand, a pretty good hand here, shield value-wise. So going over to the opponent's turn, we want to play the Wild Intelligence, so we take the 1 damage. Heal Trigger, doesn't really matter. So on to our turn, draw 1, PG, don't really need it. From here, though, I think keeping the Rogue Headhunter here, I kind of set up that the opponent might not be as aggressive of a deck, so we want to keep Rogue Headhunter here. I mean, the better discard might actually be the Heal, as it's the lowest shield value, unless it's like you're up against a crit-focused, crit-gaining deck, you can discard the critical, but we'll just say we're not. Discard that to be able to ride our Black Tears Husk Dragon, add back the Wild Intelligence, and then play the Wild Intelligence. Counterblast 1, mill 1, 2, 3. Roaming Prison Dragon, Gather Upon You Wandering Souls, phenomenal mills, especially with having an extra order in hand as well. So here, what do we want to call off of it? Well, I think in this discard pile, Shadow Cloak's the best one, even if we can't get off its effect, as it allows us to bounce stuff back in later turns. So we'll call that one out, send that one back. And here I would say keep the Rogue Headhunter to use its effect, as we might want to do Wild Intelligence plus Cloud Miasma next turn. It might need the Counterblast reduction, or since my opponent's not necessarily a very aggressive deck, they might not attack more into Shadow Cloak, and therefore I might not even take a damage. Or I can choose even not to take a damage with my big shield hand and just go Clouded Miasma plus, say, Gather Upon You Wandering Souls. So there's a ton of options here. But anyway, Smash, Black Tear Husk Dragon, Drive Check, Crit Trigger, awesome. Shadow Cloak, and then pass turn. So my opponent goes up to grade 3. More than likely we'll be facing down some attacks here. So let's just say that they do in fact get rid of the Shadow Cloak. Oh well, did what it needed to. And here, with our setup here, we might also want to start trying to call stuff, but we also don't have many call targets, so that's another thing to consider. But let's just say we do take the 1 damage, just in case we want to use the Wild Intelligence again, and we block with a 15k shield. Pass the turn over, draw for turn, Clouded Miasma, we definitely don't need 2 orders, so we'll discard 1, ride into Zorga, and let's see what we can do. Rogue Headhunter will be a great call here regardless, to start saving some pressure. And here, can use Zorga's ability. And here, while we definitely have use of Gather, we only have 1 copy of Roaming Prison Dragon, so I think we want to use a Wild Intelligence again, in which case we discard Wild Intelligence to get back. We have 2 of each, so let's just grab back Clouded Miasma, as is the one we want to keep most evolved, and let's use it. Clouded Miasma, Alchemagic with Wild Intelligence, reduce Counterblast cost by 1, so it only costs a Counterblast. We get 1 call, and then with the effect, and then a mill 3 and call 1. So we can just call back here, yet again, Shadow Cloak I think is the best one, as it's a phenomenal attacker here, to round out the other column since we don't have 2 Roaming Prison Dragons yet. Gains the ability, then we get the mill 3, Actia Sticky, and Roaming Prison Dragon. Awesome, we're set up for next turn yet again. So now we get the 1 call off of Wild Intelligence, and here, definitely setting up the Actia Sticky will be very nice for next turn, as we have not seen Tearful Malice yet, and if we choose to, we can definitely choose to take a lot of damage to enable Actia Sticky if we so choose to. So, call Actia Sticky out, and Shadow Cloak did not see the timing of the order, therefore we do not get its effect, nor would I use it, but we do, oop, that's the wrong one. We do get the 1 Roaming Prison Dragon that was in the drop zone originally, called out. So, still not a bad board. This one has the plus 5k as well, so we just get to swing for 23 in a Twin Drive. Crit Trigger, awesome. Front Trigger, really great offensive triggers, making up for not the most ideal order combo. Then, of course, we can swing with Crit Pressure, swing here, we could have even swung here into a Rear Guard, and then Crit Pressure if need be. Just anything to threaten the opponent depending on what they have out. So, of course, it might go over to their turn. Here, as I was discussing, we might want to use Actia Sticky to clear it, and then Clouded Miasma plus something else, and really the only thing we have right now is Wild Intelligence. So that's an important thing to kind of keep track of in terms of damage, because here it might be more optimal to just take the 3 damage to be able to use that counterblast on what we have. So let's just take 1 damage, crit trigger, okay. Let's take 2 damage, crit trigger, okay. So here, again, we really seem like we want to be able to use those counterblasts, reset stuff, so let's just take all 3 damage, Shadow Cloak. As all we're doing here is really just be able to play out our turn, but also save a ton of guard to survive my opponent's onslaught next turn. So just because you're taking more damage, putting yourself at higher damage, does not mean you're actually behind. It just means you're able to do more on your turn, and you're conserving shield to guard later attacks. And we're kind of at the stage of the game where attacks are reaching their height of their power as well. So we draw per turn, and actually that's a phenomenal draw here, because what we can do is we can first use Actia Sticky's ability, of course. So we can... Oh, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. We want to Persona Ride here, gain the 10k and draw 1. Another order card, that's phenomenal. So we have a few options here. We've actually seen a lot of our triggers already. We saw 2 in the damage check, another third one in damage. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in hand, so that's already 8 triggers out. And then that'd be 9, 10. So we only have 6 triggers left in deck, and our deck is still pretty thick. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 cards. So that's, I said 6 out of 18, so that's a third of my deck. So we could view this card as we get 3 chances to see our deck, so we're likely to see at least 1 trigger off of that, as opposed to 2 where it's a bit less than that. Or we can always Alchemagic with In Search of a Faraway Ideal, because we don't really need the Wild Intelligence here. So we can also do that just to kind of close out the game, and I think that depends on your opponent's state. Do you think the power will lend more to it, or do you think that just being able to cycle out more order cards to get more shield value in hand and possibly hit a trigger is better? So I'm going to do that play here, as I think that's the more interesting play, and In Search, it's like if your opponent's at 5 damage or 4 or 5 damage, you just need to close it out. That was probably the better play. But let's see. So now I can use Actia Sticky's ability, Counterblast 1, and here we don't really need... We can bounce stuff back for sure. That's definitely an option here. But at the same time, the question is, what else are you retiring off of Actia Sticky other than Roaming and Shadow Cloak? So that's another thought to have. But at the same time, since we're going to dig a bit deeper in deck, we might find another Persona Ride, and we got plenty of shield in hand. So I'm not going to worry about that with this play. We'll retire the 2 to draw 1, another Roaming Prison Dragon, and give it 5,000 power. Then we'll use Zorga's ability to Soul Blast 1. Discard. I'd say the Roaming Prison Dragon here is fine. A bit better than Norse because it lets us set up for another Gather the following turn. To be able to get back, of course... Actually, I forgot. Yeah, I have one in drop. That's the other reason I did it. To grab back, of course, Clouded Miasma to hand. Then Alchemagic with Clouded Miasma plus our Gather and Drop Zone. So we have to pay Counterblast 1. Discard 1 order card. So I'll discard, just say the In Search of a Faraway Ideal. That way this is hidden information right now. So we get to call 1 and give the Vanguard the power. So here, since we're not really bouncing back, we can just go for power. If we had an Alana here, that's another brilliant play to make. But we don't, so let's just grab back the Rank or Chain to make better numbers behind Vanguard. And then gives the power, and then of course gains the extra drive. And then the 2 Roaming Prison Dragons, and I have 3 technically in Drop Zone now, but we only will end up using 2 of them, naturally. No reason to use the 3rd one. And we've got our powerful board set up again to be able to swing with Triple Drive, PG, Roaming Prison Dragon, Shadow Cloak. So didn't see any triggers, but another PG, great to survive the opponent's turn, and we still have these 2 huge columns to try to do stuff with. So if that didn't close out the game, we've got plenty of guard for the next turn to be able to survive, and we actually would draw into Persona Ride next turn to be able to repeat with some powerful Alchemagics. So that is my Grave Zorga list post Festival Collection 2022 and before DBT06. I've enjoyed this deck ever since it originally came out. When Blue Zorga, the Mysterious Rain Spiritual Zorga, originally came out in DBT01, the deck fascinated with the order cards, properly utilizing them, and just trying to figure out the best strategy to capitalize on sort of the toolbox nature of this deck and around the 3 attack limitation. And I've had a lot of fun just upgrading it over the sets and just kind of routing out this build. It's one of my personal favorite pet projects, a really fun deck for me to play as, even though it's 3 attacks, it's so satisfying when you can get the most out of those 3 attacks and I've heard many opponents say when they play against me that it feels, when I get my deck going, it feels unbeatable. That being said, though, it can break at times, and it really relies on seeing these roaming prison dragons. But really, these pieces do work, and I find it to be a lot of fun. And also, never expected to actually bling out this deck in the way I did, but thankfully these were cheap enough where I wanted it enough that I was able to get them. So a lot of fun there. Of course, if you play Zorga, I'd love to hear what your build looks like down in the comments below. How does it differ? How is it the same? Have you noticed some of the same things I brought up or not? There's a lot of variability in this deck, which is one of the reasons why I also think it is so fun. Also look forward to a match that I had with someone on Different Fights Discord coming out probably the day after this video goes live, and I'll probably post some more gameplay of it in the future. Don't know when that will be, but I definitely love the deck enough that you'll be seeing it from time to time as well.